He is going to give some voice to what's happening to us here in Nashville now. Thank you all for coming. And,
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for thinking of me as young. As young as I've felt in a while. When I said this is going to be on YouTube, I jokingly said, well, maybe my son will actually listen to me for once. So I hope you don't mind a four-hour lecture on plagiarism.
How old is your son?
My son's 16.
AI.
That's 32 in YouTube years, I think. Yeah, my name is Steve Haruch. Thank you so much for being here. And so I think that I just want to preface this by something that I think a lot of you already know, which is that even though this is a history group, I am not a historian, so I just want to get that out in front. I did recently have coffee with a real historian that I think a lot of you are familiar with, Dr. Lorotha Williams at TSU. I think as so many conversations do that we have with each other in this city, we got to talking about how the city is changing and so forth. I was talking to him about history and journalism, and as a historian, he said, you know, what's so important to him is the work of journalism and the news, and he referred to it as the first draft of history, which a phrase I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And so I think sort of maybe a subtext of this talk will be, as the city has changed at this like sort of dizzying pace, as I think all of us are aware, at the same time that this is happening, the news profession, the industry of journalism has been in a very steady decline, and a precipitous decline. And I think the most recent article that I read about it says that in this country we are losing a local newspaper, roughly 3 of them a day. So I think in that context, I think one of the many things that is challenging and distressing about this time, in a time when the state is changing so much, is that our capacity to know about what's going on through the news media is actually being deteriorated. At the same time as all of these social media channels now allow us to, if we want, sort of self-selective, very narrow view of what is happening, or to disregard what's happening. So sort of that is kind of the backdrop. I do think that all that sounded very bad, I know. But I also hope that the other subtext here is that we as a community have a real opportunity still in front of us to change all of this. And when I say all, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I do think that as a community we have a chance to affect what is happening to our city and in our city, maybe more than we think. And I want to get into that a little bit a little later on. I want to start with a little bit from this book. It's called Greetings from New Nashville. I know that some of you may be familiar with it or have read it. The subtitle is How a Sleepy Southern Town Became Its City. And the genesis for this project was I tried to retire from journalism and thought, oh, I'm going to take a nice, peaceful job at the bookstore. I love books. I got to be the marketing manager at Parnassus for a while. I got to hang out with Ann Patchett, which was kind of wild, you know, like got to meet all kinds of authors that I admired. It was great. And what kept happening is that people would come in and say, I visited Nashville 10 years ago. It was nothing like this. I want to read a book that explains what happened. Well, I grew up here and moved away. Like, what is going on? Or just I live here and I want to know what's going on. and you know, if you've been into a real bookstore, you know that the bookseller is very determined to find you this book, right? When you say, I want a book that does this, they're like, okay, hold on. And they'll go around and out, they'll ask all the other booksellers, like, do you know a book? And it turns out that there really wasn't one. And so that's why I pitched Vanderbilt University Press. I basically said, this is a book that people have been asking for and it doesn't exist, can I make one for you? And so I don't think that it's a perfect book. I know that's why I'm not in marketing anymore. But I also think that we're sort of in the middle of this in a way that we don't know all the things that we need to know. And in some ways we still, as a city, don't know what we don't know. But if sort of journalism is the first draft of history, I'd like to think of a book like this, which sort of collects different pieces, as maybe a second draft, or a 1.5 draft. If you're someone like me who's like, oh, that's not really a second draft. Let's call that 1.5. So what I did for the book was try to collect a bunch of different things that had been published at various points along the way that sort of seemed to observe that something is changing here, something is a little bit different, and also to commission some things that said, well, looking back now, we understand that this was an important moment, or this was an important thing that happened, or this is something that we didn't think was important at the time. So I decided to start the book in 1998 because a tornado took out a bunch of East Nashville, and we got Major League Sports for the first time. Preds, yes, and then Titans shortly thereafter. And the question of where to start, I looked back at my original pitch for the book, the email that I sent to my editor, and I said, I think the book, I meant the book, not It City, but I think it starts with the tornado in 1998 that tears up a bunch of East Nashville and creates the conditions for musicians to buy cheap, renovate, and begin changing the character of the neighborhood. So much so that by 2007, Ann Patchett is writing about the East Side for the New York Times like it's Greenwich Village in the 70s. I think we know what happened to Greenwich Village, right? But I would argue that a lot of us in 2007 did not think that what happened to Greenwich Village was going to happen to East Nashville, right? I certainly never imagined that I would see a sign for an open house in East Nashville and the asking price had 7 digits in it. You know, I know people who tried to buy in East Nashville and the houses didn't appraise because the appraiser was like, well, you want to pay how much for a house in East Nashville? No. So that was the reason for 98, and I want to read a little quote from Rebecca Solnit. I quote her in the introduction to the book, but as I was getting ready for this, I kind of flipped through the book again because I hate to admit this, but even if you write a book, you forget parts of it. So Rebecca Solnit was writing about San Francisco, but I was really struck by this passage in a book called Hollow City, The Siege of San Francisco and the Crisis of American Urbanism. Quote, every city changes, and walking through a slowly changing city is like walking through an organic landscape during various seasons. Leaves and even trees fall, birds migrate, but the forest stands. Familiarity anchors the changes. But if the pace of change accelerates, a disjuncture between memory and actuality arises, and one moves through a city of phantoms, of the disappeared, a city that is lonely and disorienting. To have your city dismantled too rapidly around you is to have the relationship between mind and place thrown into disarray. Does that feeling seem familiar to anyone in this room? Right? And so again, you know, when I talked about sort of comparing East Nashville to Greenwich Village in the 70s, now we're talking about San Francisco in the 90s, and I lived on the West Coast in the 90s and saw San Francisco start to change. And when I moved to Nashville, the idea that somehow that at any point Nashville and San Francisco would be in the same sentence in a way that made any sense to me. This was more than 20 years ago. I did not think that was possible. And here I am quoting Rebecca Solnit writing about San Francisco in the introduction to this book. So I think that all of us share the sense that all of a sudden something hit warp speed and the city just sort of changed under our feet. And I know that pretty much everyone that I know who's been here more than a couple of years can relay multiple experiences where they turned a corner and they said, "What is that?"
When did that happen?
Right, when did that happen?
What was that before?
And why can't I remember what was there before, right? So that happens. It's either I remember what was there before and I feel that loss, or it has changed so much, so dramatically that I can't even, your brain kind of short circuits on what was there before. Of course, not that change is bad in and of itself, but I think when that happens to you enough times in a row, I think you get the sensation that Rebecca Solnit describes here, that your mind seems disconnected from the place, which I think sometimes it is dangerous because it makes us related to what I said earlier, it makes us feel like we no longer have control over it, or it makes us feel like we don't have a relationship to it anymore that's meaningful, right? We sort of feel like the city is happening to us, and not a place where we find refuge and community, and that we relate to each other in. We sort of feel like the city is an event that keeps happening on top of us. My son goes to Hume Fogg, so the city does happen to him fairly regularly. But that's maybe another story. So, sort of in the middle of this, in 2013, 2013 is when the It City story dropped from Kim Severson. I think all of us remember this moment in the New York Times where we got this weird title that we didn't know what to do with, right? That we were the It City. And then shortly after that, an editor from the Times asked me to write something about what it's like to live in this place that's changing so fast. And so I did, and it was I have to admit, it was a bit of a bummer, that essay, because I really was concerned that all of the energy seemed to be going toward tourism and shiny things for people who already had a lot of money. And I tried to remind people that John Edgerton was quoted in the original It City stories warning about this, saying that if we're not taking care of people, then none of this big, shiny, happy stuff is important. It's not meaningful if we're not taking care of everyone. So I try to remind people of that element of the It City piece. So that essay was called High Rises versus Honky Tonks. I cannot take credit for that title. That was my editor, Clay Risen, who was a native Nashvilleian. He's at the Times, but he grew up here. Some of you may actually know Clay. Anyone? Yeah, okay. So the essay was called High Rises versus Honky Tonks, and I recently discovered that there was actually a fundraiser for the Nashville Downtown Partnership called High Rises and Honky Tonks. And this is when I was like, okay, maybe irony is truly dead. Like my mighty cautionary tale about overdevelopment is now, the title is basically being used as this fundraiser to build up downtown more. Again, I don't have anything against development per se. I just thought this was funny. So the book ends in 2018, which conveniently made 20 years, but 2018 was also, we had Mayor Megan Berry resigning. That's a topic for another day. The transit plan was defeated. We had the Waffle House shooting. We had Amazon announce that they were coming to Nashville. I believe that was the year that the soccer stadium was approved, Geodis Park, and the Police Oversight Board, the Community Oversight Board for Police, passed on that amendment. So I think sort of symbolically, all of those things point to, like, you can tell that the city is, things are really changing in very significant ways, right? This is not just, we got a Trader Joe's, right? Like, the city is really like these are sort of big things, right? So that's where we decided the book would end. And I think that around that time, 2018, a lot of the conversations that I was having, at least, and that I was hearing about, were still kind of in this zone of what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do with this It City thing now that it's here, right? Like, so I collected a few headlines from this time. I think it sort of take me back to sort of the conversations a lot of us were having. Whose It City is Nashville, question mark. Is Nashville's It City reputation getting frayed around the edges? Airbnb has taken over Nashville. Nashville, a boomtown in bust, right? Like suddenly we have it all, but we don't know what to do with it. And we're nervous. I think as a city, we're really nervous about where is this whole thing going. And there is a sense that something in there that makes us, Nashville, is in danger of being lost. And I think that feeling, we still have it, but I think it was very urgent in that period between 2013, when we got the crown placed on our head, and 2018, where the book ends. I actually had someone who worked in the Barley administration say to me that they read the book and it made them think again about things that they had done to try to speed up, like to accelerate the growth of the city. Like it gave them pause, like maybe there are some things we should have thought about differently. I think that the city is in the midst of what I think is kind of an extended identity crisis. And I think that since 2018, that identity crisis has gotten maybe deeper. But again, I do think that it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to think about what we want and what we expect from each other. So, I no longer work at the bookstore. And this is the part of the talk where I'm going to talk about the show This Is Nashville, which I was a founding senior producer for, with many caveats. So, when Jean first asked me to do this talk, and I said yes, some months ago, I was the senior producer of This Is Nashville, and my plan was to talk about how the show is trying to explore this question of what we're doing here with all of this. And in fact, we called the show, in a lot of the promotional materials, we called it A Journey into the Identity of Nashville. And if you haven't listened to the show, the premise was basically that we talked to Nashvillians about their actual lived experience of the city. Not that we didn't have fancy people on, important people on, but we prioritized people who were just living in the city and feeling the effects of these things that sometimes you hear about kind of abstractly, like in policy and debate at the council, right? We prioritize the lived experience of people living here. And some important things that I've learned in that experience is that a lot of Nashvillians are not aware of each other. There are like pockets around the city, but they are very hungry to learn that other people experience the city maybe differently than they do. That their experience of the city involves challenges that they do not have, or advantages that they do not have. That people are really interested in meeting each other and knowing more about each other. I also felt like this identity crisis that people were feeling, that not everyone agreed on what that identity was in the first place. And then we had a lot of work to do to talk about that. And I think that if there was something good that came out of the summer of 2020, and what happened after George Floyd was murdered, was that we started to feel like we had to have these conversations whether we wanted to or not. I don't think we're done talking to each other, and I don't think that we necessarily understand each other as deeply as we could as a city. But something that I observed in working on the show day to day was that people do want to know, and they're very interested to hear just what people are going through, and I'm really empathizing with that. I also learned, I basically spent 4 months producing one episode of the show, so I'm just gonna tell you a quick story. I came to be aware that there was a woman in North Nashville named Simone Boyd. Some of you may know her name. If not, she was basically, they were proposing like a high-rise in the middle of North Nashville, and she was sort of leading the neighborhood charge to ask questions about this project, right? And to ask if the community could have some input into the project, because if you look at the block, it was going to be like that, right? And so, as you can imagine, there were some concerns, right? So I met her, I took a walk from her around North Nashville. She sort of told me a lot about the history of that area from the perspective of people who grew up there, which I did not. I asked her if we could keep in touch after this. Well, as it turns out, that she got her way, and the development was considerably altered, and so I didn't have to have her on the show to talk about the development. But I asked her to keep in touch about North Nashville. She had an art project that was honoring some of the women who had helped keep that neighborhood together, sort of informally throughout the civil rights era. You can imagine women baking, giving food to neighbors, taking in the neighborhood children, wherever they may be, just sort of pillars of the neighborhood. And I'm getting to the point here, I promise. What she told me was, because I said, I really want to have these people on the show, that the descendants of the women she was honoring. She said, what you have to understand is that a lot of these people do not trust the media because of the way the Black experience has been portrayed, especially what has happened in North Nashville. And so to get back to what I said at the very beginning about journalism as the first draft of history, what I began to realize is that here, even in this city, there were people who did not participate in the first draft, who are absent from the first draft. And so when I say that one of the subtexts here is how journalism can help, it is also about, I think, asking the right questions about who has been heard historically. And so a big goal of ours in putting the show together was to sort of reverse this hierarchy of a lot of times, especially in public radio, you get the council members, you get the professors, you get people with credentials and standing, right? These are people that I admire. I mean, I mentioned Dr. Williams earlier. These are people that I admire and that we need to hear from. But we were, like, ratio-wise, we wanted to invert that and say, yes, there are people with credentials, but I want to hear from the people who lived in this neighborhood and made it what it was, and hear from them what they feel has been lost, and what they feel is worth holding on to. And that is the conversation that we were really trying to foster on the show. I say that in the past tense because I left the show, and the reason I left the show is because the leadership of the station decided to terminate the executive producer immediately with no notice, and they subsequently lied about why they did it. And I did not want to engage in a debate about that, but what it signaled to me was that that inversion of we want to hear from the community, that wasn't the model they wanted. I'm sorry?
When was it that you left?
I left in September, 1 month after this change happened. I tried to stay on. I don't want this to be a referendum on the show, but just merely to explain why I was using the past tense there. I do not believe that the show that is currently on the air should be called what it's called anymore. But I'll just stop there. Okay, so exciting news, which is that I am working on a sequel to this book after many conversations in which people said, yeah, the first book was great. You know, since that book came out, it seems like a whole lot of stuff has happened.
20?
Yeah. So, I mean, and so I've focus group tested this. By focus group, I mean people that I know, which obviously has its own biases, but, you know, I've just sort of said, I'm thinking about doing a second book because Nashville has really changed as much between 2018 and 2023 as it did from 98 to 2018. And mostly people are like, yeah, that sounds about right. So I would love to have a little bit of a conversation after I wrap up here. I'd love your questions and your input also, but as I'm sort of working on the first draft, maybe the second draft of these last few years, one, I'm finding that the sources that I went to to include in the first book, there just aren't as many good analytical pieces to pick from over the past 5 years as there were. And I mean, obviously it's a longer period, but you can really feel the cuts to some of the local newsrooms when I was like trying to find like, give me a good story that talks about this. And what I'm able to find is a piece here and a piece there, and nothing that I really want to print on paper. As I'm looking forward and thinking about this moment that we're in right now, I'm thinking kind of in terms of, do we have any baseball fans in the house?
Sure, yes.
Okay. All right, so there's 162 games in the Major League season, right? That's a lot of games. So Ken Harrelson, who's the announcer, TV announcer, or was for the Chicago White Sox, who I've been misfortunate of caring about because I grew up rooting for that team. What he says at the beginning of every year is, you're gonna win 60 games and you're gonna lose 60 games. It's the other 42 that you're really fighting for. And he says, I keep track of the season a little differently. Of those 42 games, there are the games that you should have won, and you won. There's the games that you should have won, but you lost. There's the games that you should have lost, but you found a way to win. And so, right now, I realize wins and losses is a very reductive way to think about this, but it's, I'm sort of using it as a jumping off point because it is the language that we get a lot about. Well, we're gonna build a new stadium and an entirely new neighborhood. It's gonna be a win for the city, right? We hear this. It's a win for the city a lot when we're asked to say, oh, here's a big shiny new thing that we're asking you to pay for. It's gonna be a win. Like overall, it's gonna be a win. We don't get very many press releases about the losses. It's true, although. If you work in the media, you get a press release from the city every couple of weeks that updates the number of guns that have been stolen from cars. We just got one today. It's 1,000. I've lost track. It's a lot. It's a lot. I think that when I'm looking forward to where the city might be headed, I'm thinking about what are the wins that we can sustain, what are the losses that we might be able to turn into wins, and what are the things that we have won that are in danger of becoming losses. So in the games you should have won, but you wound up losing. I kind of think of the community oversight board in that category. Not that it's the city's fault necessarily, but that was in 2018. That felt like a win for the community, and it's really been taken away from the community, right? So that's a win that becomes a loss. I think that I don't know if you remember this when Carl Dean was running for governor. There was a lot of talk about sort of how Nashville is a very welcoming place, and that Tennessee is a very welcoming place, and we see how like there's been a very pointed movement to make Tennessee a less welcoming place. I'll just put that sort of in general terms for the moment. There are also, I think, those wins, or I'm sorry, those losses that could still turn into wins, right? We did not get a comprehensive transit plan in 2018, but it sure sounds like we're going to get a chance at it again, right? If you're someone who thinks that the city that's growing at this rate needs a different transit solution, it looks like you're going to have your chance to vote on that. I can't think of any of the candidates for mayor who was going to make this more of a priority than Freddie O'Connell, so it sure seems like we're heading in that direction. Remember I said earlier, in some ways we don't know what we don't know. I think for a lot of the city, something that a lot of people didn't know was that Tennessee State had been underfunded all these many years. It's very interesting that that $2 billion, we got a stadium, we got TSU underfunding. Like, who thought that $2 billion was going to come up twice, right? But the fact that the Governor Lee earmarked some money to make up for the first, this gets complicated, I'll try not to get too into the weeds here, but Governor Lee did send some money in the direction of TSU before the $2 billion number came up. So now there is an opportunity. There's a number out there that says, historically, the state has shortchanged this institution, and there is a path toward repair. There's a path toward repaying that. And who knows what TSU could become if they get that money, right? That's something we didn't know. We didn't know that TSU, which gave us Olympic champions, in addition to all the other things that TSU has given us, could, without the funding, there is this path toward having a public R1 research university here in Nashville that is not privately owned, that is not, that is part of our community in a way that Vanderbilt is not. I mean, Vanderbilt is obviously an amazing institution, but it is a private school, and it very much feels that way, at least to me as someone who does not attend Vanderbilt University, and occasionally tries to attend an event there and can't park within a mile of where I'm going. Anyway, so when I said earlier that I think that we have, as a community, we have an opportunity, I think it really is in hearing each other and deciding that our collective voice is important, and sort of getting in the way of what feel like these really giant wheels that move without us. This feeling that the city is happening to us happens when we feel disconnected, when we are not listening to each other. So I think one of the lessons of meeting so many, we had 1,500 people on the show in the time that I was there. So meeting that many people over that amount of time really made me appreciate just like what a dynamic place this is. And I think that gets lost a lot, in part, and as a member of the media, I have to accept some of the blame for this, because I think a lot of times we talk about things as like horse race and win-lose, both sides, one side, the other side, but all of us, I think, as a city, as a body of people, if you think about the place as multifaceted and not a place that has two sides, then I think your conversations get a lot more interesting, and I think that your sense of what is necessary and possible also becomes a lot more interesting. Do you have things that you want to talk about in the time that we have left?
What are you doing for work right now?
Okay. Well, this is a very, very practical question. So I'm doing some consulting for the Nashville Banner. I don't know if any of you are familiar. The Banner was a daily paper here for about 100 years, and it is being revived as a digital-only news source led by Steve Cavendish, former editor of the Nashville Scene, and Dimitri Kalodimos, former anchor for a station she probably doesn't want me to name. We both share the experience of having left an institution under unhappy terms. But so Steve and Dimitri are leading the Banner, and right now I'm doing some mostly behind the scenes work for them as they get ready to kind of launch up to the next level. As you may have noticed, those of you who follow the Banner, there's a story here and there, because there's really only one reporter right now, but they're getting ready to sort of make the next step, hire some more reporters. I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say publicly, but let's just say there's some really cool stuff on tap. There are, I think, maybe some names you will recognize who might be joining soon. And yeah, very excited about the Banner. I saw a hand over here.
Well, I was just going to point out that you mentioned the referendum on the transit system, and I think a lot of people would say it's the way that it was structured. It was a whole lot of money without a whole lot of detail, and that's the reason that it failed. The other thing is, are you aware of the 2005 plan by the Nashville Civic Design Center called the Plan of Nashville?
Yes. I don't know the details very well.
I'll get you a copy.
Now, that's not the one that Christine wrote, Christine Craling?
Yes.
It is, okay. I do have a copy of that. Although, if I may, another thing that I've noticed is how the plans get made and put on the shelf. And then, this is partly just because of mayoral turnover, but...
It also had no teeth. It had no legal teeth.
Right. Yeah. I was, real quick aside, I actually helped put together a report called Envision Nolensville. And I was very excited to do this work, and I did a whole series of oral histories with people in, around Glencliff, and there were interviews with a young person who lived there now, often the child of immigrants, and someone who grew up in the neighborhood in the 50s, sort of talking across generations. It was great. And there was a whole press conference. I spoke before Mayor Berry, which felt very surreal, and then the announcement was made that these oral histories would be archived at the library. Fast forward, I'm working in radio, and I say, hey, remember those oral histories I did? This would be great to maybe build a show around. And I called the library and I said, yes, can you tell me where the oral histories are kept? Because I put those together and they were great. They were like, I don't know what you're talking about. all that to say that I think that the record of the city sometimes is not very well kept, and I think that is something also for us to think about in terms of first drafts and second drafts. Once we get a draft down, we gotta keep track of where it went. I still have a copy of the oral histories, but it really bummed me out that they never actually made it to the library. Okay, that's enough. Yes.
I think one of the, to me, saddest consequences of this, and I lived in New York during the 70s, but here is you lose, because of the economics, some of the most creative people. They go. The creative people can't afford to stay, especially in the early stages of their careers.
Yeah.
And I know in New York, you kept moving farther and farther and farther and farther out, to another borough.
Right.
And here they're moving south in the suburbs, but it's like, you lose that kind of soul quality of a city. And the other aspect is people who live here, who are not wealthy, live in the suburbs, who are used to going in for cultural events, they loved it, they could park on the street or here or there. They go to the art walk and this and that. They can't afford to park. It's not their city anymore in terms of the culture, the life. And so I have a cousin who's moved to St. Petersburg, where you can still, get around a bit or live. But it's just, I think that's it.
Yeah.
For me, it seems the saddest.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. Yeah.
I put in some perspective. I owned a store in Nashville that was pretty popular from 1987 to 2019. And in 2012, when the TV show Nashville came on, that's when we saw huge change done.
Yeah.
And we always felt like that TV show ruined us.
The thought on the table is that the TV show Nashville ruined this time.
Let's not go that far. Brought it a lot of attention.
I've definitely heard support for that theory. Yeah.
You keep saying we don't know what we don't know, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I moved here in 2016 and thought it was wonderful, and then that's kind of when I started noticing the push forward in unchecked growth. And but the thing is, we do know from others, and the fact that they allowed this without, I'm a planner, I'm an urban planner, so I look at it and say there's plenty of cities and states to look at who went through this same kind of, growth spurt and instituted smart growth, not irresponsible growth, which is what they have here. And I think it's far too late to start any kind of mass transit, except buses, and I don't consider buses, obviously it's not rapid transit, it's just mass transit, so yeah, a lot of people can pile on a bus, but I think they're so far behind the 8 ball, I don't see them pulling out of it, and it's a travesty, because it was, I thought, a fabulous place. And then also the other point you keep saying about we don't talk to each other or what, I think we do, but the disconnect is with our elected officials who are completely not interested really in their constituents unless the constituent happens to be kind of on board with their little pet project. And I think that's a big problem. I have more to say, but I'll let you all carry on.
Yeah.
One more, I retired and closed the store in 2019 because my rent tripled. And that was part of this. And I have so many people with small businesses and restaurants that had to give up because of the cost of renting. And the space that I rented was taken over by another small business that failed, and now it's a chain. So.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You mentioned kind of the role of the media and the deterioration of the media and the role that's played in some of the challenges we're facing right now. You said you're advising, the Banner on some of their things, but more broadly, what do you think of the prospects for the media and to have kind of informed, intelligent content that can allow people to make smart decisions here? Do you see any path back, like whether it's a business model or anything that would restore that industry to what it maybe used to be?
Restoring the media to its previous grandeur. Small question, David, but I'll. Okay, in all honesty, I believed this before I ever did any work for the Banner, which is I think that their coverage of the election was the best in the city, hands down, because they didn't chase only the shiny stories that had some conflict or some controversy. They sat down with every candidate and asked them basically the same questions, so that if you wanted to, you could just say, here are all the candidates with very little filter. And the Banner's model, I think, is a good one, which is that it's supported by the community. There's no paywall. The problem with, I'll use the euphemism, corporate-owned media, is that it's still very much an ad-driven business model. The ads do not pay what they once paid, so if you want lots of clicks, you publish lots of stories about Taylor Swift, and not about what's happening in your Metro Council. You might in fact hire a reporter to do nothing but talk about Taylor Swift, and not what's going on in your Metro Council, not what's going on at the Planning Commission meetings. So when you remove those incentives, and it's supported by the community, then I think you have a chance then to have an unbiased news source that you can depend on because you support it, and that you have input into it because you are in essence a shareholder in that organization. So I do think that the nonprofit model has a lot of promise, and I'm actually really excited about the Banner for that reason. So yeah, I don't think it's the only model. I think people forget that the original business model of the newspaper, which is sell advertisements and classifieds, like all of those things that used to prop up the newspaper have gone to other places, right? Like you're not putting your apartment for rent or selling your china cabinet in the newspaper anymore. You once did. You're doing those on other platforms. So once you strip away all that kind of income, all you're left with is ads. And all the ad people want to hear is how many impressions, how many impressions. And the only way to juice that is to really play to the lowest common denominator, and celebrity news, right? That's really the only way to sort of generate the kind of ad revenue you want. That is not a great service to the community. I mean, I think Taylor Swift is great, but I also want to know what's happening in the Metro Council, more than I want to know what's happening with Taylor Swift. Or as much, let's say as much. Yes?
How do you see Nashville's neighborhoods evolving into the future? That gives so much of a cool character and identity to the greater metro.
Right. This is probably a better question for someone who's a real historian, but I do think that as sort of the first wave of the first city wave is really is downtown, right? Downtown sort of growing. We sort of have the gulch adjacent to that, right? Sort of it's the urban core, right? And sort of that becoming much more desirable, and everything in that zone, and that zone just keeps getting bigger, right? It's over into East Nashville, it's into North Nashville. And I think one of the things that's really distressing to me about the neighborhood change is it's not so much that, because neighborhoods do change over time, they just do. But to see these small starter affordable homes get knocked down for what looks like a couple of boxes stacked on top of each other. It looks or some of them sort of look like if you took 4 outhouses and right? And so like I think there's a very interesting, speaking of Christine Kraling, I think there's a very interesting study to be done of like the sort of like just the street level architecture of the city, and in these neighborhoods where you see like a pre-war house, and actually I started to do a PowerPoint, and I'm like, I'm not gonna be one of those people who reads off the screen, so but the opening image was two of these sort of tall and skinny things next to this little brick, one-story house that was probably built in the 40s. So I think that not only do the neighborhoods, there is, to me anyway, there's a sense that like the individual characters of the neighborhoods is really kind of dissolving. Like it's
all homogeneous.
it's, yeah, the sort of like the price point of all the restaurants has gone up, right? Like sort of so many of the fun, little, funky, independently owned shops where you might find things that you're not going to find at Target. A lot of those things seem to be disappearing. I live in East Nashville, and like to see like a chain taco place like in the middle of the neighborhood, it's like, why? And it's because that's who can afford the rent, I think, sometimes coming in. So my biggest question, I'm sorry you asked the question, I'm answering it with a question, but my biggest question is like, how sustainable is this? Like, are we gonna run out of rich people at some point, and then what? Like then what happens? Does California have that many rich people? I just don't know. Is the supply endless? We can't just blame California. But right now I feel like that what's happening is that the neighborhoods are becoming less and less distinct from each other. Which frothy monkey do you want to go to? Not to disparage a local business, but even that, I think, like the idea that something that's successful in one neighborhood, let's do it in another neighborhood that's hot right now. I like to see local business owners succeed, but also I would like to see different business owners succeed. I'd like the neighborhoods to be a little bit different from each other. I always am sort of blown away when I go down Charlotte and then see like the 5 Points pizza and 8th and roast, like the 8th and roast that's not an 8th, the 5 Points pizza that's not in 5 Points, right? Yeah, so I don't know, I think that the sort of the sameness, I think, is the trend right now, and I'm not sure. I know that in North Nashville there's a very concerted effort to try to preserve some of the historic character of that neighborhood, but I don't know. I think it's a challenge for sure. Yeah.
I hope in your new book that you cover 2 stories of success, and that would be what happened with the Church Street Park. Tony Gerentana, and I think that killed David Riley's campaign, because people were outraged that they were going to make that park into a tower.
Right.
And then more importantly, this piece of property, Fort Negley, because of Robert Hicks, and I mean Robert Hicks lost a lot of friends, but he vehemently said this is a crazy thing sponsored by Megan Barry, and it got killed. And so there have been some really good things that have happened. I think, people care.
Yeah, and I didn't get into all the wins, but Fort Negley is definitely, I think, it is an ongoing success story, and I think that that's something that I worked on for the show, and was really looking forward to sort of the follow-up as we see the master plan kind of get built out. I think you're absolutely right that Fort Negley is a win. There's a piece from Margaret Rankel, I think many of you are familiar with Margaret, the New York Times columnist. My inside joke with Margaret is that, I published something in the Times, she tried to get into the Times for years and years and years, and now she's a regular columnist, and I published something once and have never been in there again, so you just don't know how it's going to turn out. Yes?
I'm concerned about all the trees that are coming down throughout the city. The whole canopy is coming down lot by lot. Every time a piece of property is sold and they come in and put multiples on that property, they take down the trees.
Yeah, I think the trees, that is, I think, a big concern for a lot of people, because, I mean, the other thing too is that you see these lots that used to have one house on a double lot, and sometimes they'll put 4 houses in, like make this mini subdivision, and it's like, it's all concrete.
Right.
Not only the tree's gone, but now it's just concrete. And so I think many of you are familiar with the urban heat island effect, right? It's just, as it turns out, heat might be a problem for us in the future. Yes?
I think my main concern is crime.
Mm.
We're 100 police officers short in Davidson County. I have a grandson who's a police officer. He was involved last night in something you saw on the news this morning. Another officer's in the hospital today. Unfortunately, he is not. But the crime is overwhelming. And as we get older, you're afraid to leave home sometimes. With the car racers going around you and shooting at, innocent people in their car, it's very, very scary.
Yeah. I think that, well, I don't have a good answer for that. I do think that people that I've talked to who work in violence prevention work and violence interruption work, I think a lot of them will say that when people don't have access to resources, that often puts them on a path that they feel they have. It puts them on a path toward not being a productive member of the community. And so I think that, and I'm not an expert, but I think that we have to think about crime holistically. I think all the problems that we've talked about, we have to think about sort of holistically, that almost nothing is sort of a single point problem. It is the sort of the fabric of the community that I think the more healthy that fabric is, the more everyone has the same access. And when people have that access and when they feel invested in each other, they're less likely to harm each other. And that may be, maybe that's idealistic of me, but I hope it's true.